My name is Andrea, and I am a 31-year-old woman. I was born and raised in a small town in northern Tennessee, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and you have to drive 40 minutes to an hour to get a job that pays a more or less decent wage. So 10 years ago, my dad found a new job in the next town over, and on his first day, he discovered that he was working in the same department with a friend he knew in grade school and who he was very fond of. His name was Sam, and he was a man in his 50s who was about 5'6" tall and weighed about 300 pounds. Before I delve into the story, I should point out that I was the victim of a lot of bullying growing up. I am a somewhat stocky-built girl, and because of that, my classmates used to pick on me quite often, so I never felt particularly pretty. So when someone complimented me on my beauty, I always used to take it as a joke. That said, when I first met Sam, I was 21 years old. I remember he used to be very nice to me and always complimented me, told me I was very pretty, and I always thanked him kindly. However, as time went on, the compliments became more and more intense. He always repeated that he would love to be with a woman of my size, that he thought curvy women were the most beautiful and things like that. But I always took these comments with humor, even if sometimes they made me a little uncomfortable, but I always let it go. I never said anything or complained about it. For the Christmas season, every year my dad's company used to organize a big dinner. I attended every one of them together with my father for 4 years, so I had the opportunity to meet several of his colleagues and also the general manager, who also offered me a job in the company. I did not hesitate to accept it, since this company paid very good salaries and gave many benefits to its workers. Besides, I would have the opportunity to work very close to my father. Surprisingly, this new job was in the same department as Sam. He would be my immediate boss, and he was also the person in charge of my training. For the next 3 months, I was working directly with Sam. This is part of my training, and during all that time, he continued to be too kind to me, praising me constantly. We also became good friends, or at least I thought so, as clearly his intentions were always other, but I will tell you about that later. At the end of my training phase, I started covering the night shift, and then I only saw Sam for about 30 minutes the supervisory round. At the time, I was in a 3-year relationship, but after 7 months of working at the company, my partner and I decided to end our relationship. This breakup was quite difficult for me, as I still had feelings for my ex, but our work schedules made it impossible for us to see each other, so we decided it would be best to separate. During this period, Sam became my pall of tears. He was very kind and very understanding too, but just when he was gaining my total trust, he started to show certain attitudes that I really didn't like. His compliments started to become a bit more intense and started to go up in tone. He no longer just told me I was pretty, he started to compliment my body. He would stare at me in a very intense way. I could almost see lust in his gaze. Whenever we were talking, he would roam my body with his eyes in a very blatant way, and when his back was to me, he would tilt his head to the side and lean in, making it very obvious that he was looking at my ass. I must confess that at first I liked his compliments and his little attentions, as well as the fact that I felt admired, even if it was by this man who could be my father. But as I told you before, I never felt particularly pretty or desirable, and in a way it suited me fine to have someone make me feel that I was. However, it got to the point where Sam started to push the boundaries. I was the only woman in my work area, so I was pretty used to being looked at by the men who worked with me, but Sam's was over the top. Once I became single, he escalated his comments and innuendos, and at one point he started making sexual advances to me and asking me about my preferences in bed, something that was completely disrespectful. Most of the time I tried to dodge bullets so things didn't get awkward. After all, he was my boss, but that didn't make things any easier. At one point he started asking me if I would be with a name his age, and he would get frustrated every time I said no. At this point, he also started making all kinds of advances and propositions, and I always turned them all down, but he never stopped. Sam started making comments about my body to other people at work, and would ask them questions about me, or try to get them to ask me the questions he wanted answers to. He did this a bunch of times to Ashton, my best friend at work. But fortunately for me, Ashton never fell for his game, even when he went so far as to offer him money. Sam would tell Ashton that he was very much in love with me, and that he just wanted to do whatever he could to win me over. But my friend knew my feelings and never did anything Sam asked him to do, besides telling me everything on the spot. This continued for about 8 months, and then Sam asked to be switched to the night shift, so my 30 minutes with him turned into 8 hours. During this period, Sam's harassment intensified even more. He started telling me all about his sexual history, without my asking, which I found disgusting. He would ask me questions and make comments of that nature, while staring at me with a horrible stare that felt almost predatory. On a couple of occasions, I told him to drop the subject, but he never stopped, and whenever he could, he moved our conversations into that realm, and at one point it was becoming simply suffocating. Just to give you an idea, one day he asked me if I would sleep with him if he won the lottery. Obviously I said no, but this didn't stop him either, as on another occasion he directly offered me $1,000 to spend the night with him. On that occasion, I tried to make it clear to him that there was no amount of money that would make me be with him. However, shortly after that, he asked me to send him nude pictures and offered to pay me for it. Of course, I also refused, and this made him angry, can you imagine? But not even for that, he stopped bothering. On the contrary, he started asking Ashton to do it himself. He offered him $1,000 for taking pictures and videos of me while he was in the room with me. In short, with the biggest possible nerve, he asked my best friend to take intimate pictures and videos of me secretly and send them to him in exchange for money. This situation was simply unbearable. However, I didn't know how to handle it. On the one hand, he was becoming a creepy and disgusting person, but he was also my boss, and I had to see him every day. All of this led to me being constantly stressed and always looking over my shoulder to see if he was watching me when I had to bend down to pick something up, or if I had to reach for something. This was so suffocating for me that it got to a point where I opted to buy my work clothes 2 sizes bigger than I was supposed to wear, this in order for the clothes to fit me very loose and not show my body shape at all. And all this just so he would stop looking at me and hopefully lose all interest or attraction for me. But he still continued to harass me. Things came to a head one day when the manager of our department, during the week leading up to Christmas, told me that during that period it would be just the 2 of us working the night shift, that is, Sam and I. I panicked and begged the manager to please not let me work alone with Sam. At that moment, I panicked and begged the manager to please not let me work alone with Sam. I explained that I was panicking about being alone with him during the night. I even told him that no woman should do it. Noticing my nervous state, the manager asked me to tell him what was going on with Sam. I confessed that at first I didn't want to tell him, but I was so tired and overwhelmed with the whole situation that I simply collapsed that day. I broke down completely and told the manager everything I had suffered since I came in and up to that moment. He listened carefully to everything I had to say, and as a result, canceled overtime, made sure I was never alone with Sam without a third person around. However, this didn't do much good, and the harassment continued for 5 more months, but fortunately, I was on medical leave for surgery for 2 of those months. However, one day I simply had enough of the situation. I went to Human Resources and exposed to the head of the department everything I was experiencing with my supervisor, and in the end, after doing an investigation within the department, they came to the conclusion that I was telling the whole truth. And a couple of weeks later, Sam was fired for harassment. But not only that, I also filed my complaint with the police, and they issued a restraining order against him. Melissa and I met in kindergarten on the playground, and since then we became best friends. We lived in the same neighborhood and our houses were relatively close, so we used to get together every afternoon to play, sometimes at her house and sometimes at mine. We also attended the same school, and over the years our friendship only grew stronger and became a strong bond of sisterhood. Melissa was my favorite person in the world. Even as a child, I valued her friendship immensely. She was the most cheerful, funniest, and coolest person I have ever met in life. While my interest in her was never romantic, and vice versa, she was the closest thing to a better half I had in my life, and I'm pretty sure this feeling was mutual. However, this all changed drastically when we were 16 years old. When she was 16 years old, Melissa's mother took her own life, and this was not only a very devastating blow for Melissa, but it was something that changed her life completely and forever, and not for the better, because from that moment on, a deep darkness took hold of my friend, and she was never the same again. This happened on a Sunday morning, when they were supposed to go to church as a family. Melissa's father worked the night shift at a grocery store, so he didn't get home until 7 a.m. While her sister slept, Melissa got up early and went to her mother's room to wake her up, as she wanted to get everything ready at home before leaving for the Sunday service. However, when she entered the room, she did not find her mother in bed. He assumed that she was in the bathroom, so he approached and knocked on the door several times, but she did not answer. For this reason, he decided to enter. And when he did, he found the lifeless body of his mother in the bathtub. She had taken her own life by slitting her wrists, so the scene must have been bloody and horrible. The fact is that this incident marked Melissa deeply, and from then on she became a completely unrecognizable person. Her countenance lost any kind of brightness, any kind of life. She became a somber and distant person. I tried many times to talk to her after that incident, to calm her down, to comfort her, but she seemed to be completely empty. She didn't even cry at her mother's funeral. She was just serious and blank-eyed the whole time, as if she wasn't there. What had happened to her was something terrible, so I thought her state was more than justifiable at the time. The problem is that this behavior persisted. Days, weeks, months went by, and Melissa was still in the same deep hole she had sunk into the day she found her mother in that bathtub. Melissa completely disconnected, completely distanced herself from her sister, her father, her friends, and me. No matter how hard I tried to reconnect with her, it was as if she just wasn't there, like some kind of living corpse. Her family was very worried, and her father begged me to try to do something for her, to bring his daughter back to him. But that was a much easier thing to say than to do. Honestly, I thought I just needed to be patient with her, and that sooner or later my best friend would come back to me. But as time went on, Melissa's actions became more and more troubling. It was clear that her mother's death had affected her much more than the other members of her family. Not surprising, considering that she was the one who found the body. However, hers seemed to be much more serious than a simple case of bereavement depression. Melissa began disappearing from home for hours at a time, only to reappear as if she had never left. And on several occasions, she disappeared for days at a time. This in itself was disturbing, but it became even worse when she began to develop a sort of fascination with the occult. About 6 months after her mother's death, Melissa joined a religious group that called itself New Age, and they were dedicated to doing spiritualistic rituals. For me in particular, this left me very surprised, because Melissa was always very skeptical of these things, besides being a little afraid of them. However, as disturbing as this was, no one had any idea how sinister and creepy this new hobby of my friend's could get. Melissa and her sister shared the same room, but this was no longer the case when she began to fill the walls with strange symbols, dark candles lit in the corners, and according to her sister, she used to hear her in the middle of the night whispering words in an unknown language, chanting songs that seemed to come from beyond the grave and even laughing in a very creepy way. Another of the strange things that began to happen during that stage did not have to do directly with Melissa, but with me. I began to have nightmares every night, more like a recurring nightmare. A nightmare in which I found myself walking in the middle of a room shrouded in darkness, and everywhere I looked I saw nothing but darkness, but then I saw a figure energy from the shadows, and the dream always ended the same way, with Melissa emerging from the shadows and attacking me. Whenever I had this nightmare, I would wake up completely startled and with the image of her face in my head, with her eyes completely empty and a very macabre smile. By this time, my birthday was approaching, and to my complete surprise, one day Melissa approached me to propose to do something together to celebrate my birthday. I can't tell you how happy I felt at that moment. I felt that all my patience had paid off, and that finally my friend was back. I assumed that the creepy dreams I had about her were due to how much I missed her. I texted her sister that day because I thought the fact that she had approached me and proposed to spend time together like before was a sign that she was on the mend. She was very happy with the news because, like me, she felt this was a step in the right direction. Melissa told me that she had a fantastic night planned. She proposed that we would go to a new Mexican food restaurant that she had heard very good references about. She also asked me if I wanted to invite someone else, but I told her that I was very happy to spend the time alone with her. Besides, I didn't want to overwhelm her by exposing her to other people when she was just coming out of her somber isolation. The day finally came, and I really can't tell you how excited I was. However, as soon as I left the house, I noticed that the night felt heavier than usual. There was a kind of restlessness in the atmosphere, and the moon had a kind of reddish color, which gave it a beautiful and somber touch at the same time. I went to the address Melissa gave me to meet her. I didn't really understand why she didn't tell me to look for her at her house, but I assumed that she had a surprise prepared for me, and what a surprise she had. When I arrived at the address, I realized that it was an old abandoned warehouse. The place was deserted, and barely had in front of it a small streetlight that emitted a dim light. At the very moment I arrived, I really felt quite uncomfortable, as there was nothing but old and abandoned warehouses in that area. Basically, there was not a single soul on the street, and it was very secluded. I stood in front of the streetlight looking for Melissa, and the more time I spent in that place, the more I felt as if the darkness was enveloping me. All I could hear were the rusty doors of the old warehouse being moved by the wind. That's when I started to hear footsteps on the gravel road. "Melissa," I called out, but I got no answer, just the sound of the old doors swinging. I called Melissa's name again, and again there was no answer. I pulled out my cell phone and sent her a text message asking her where she was, checking the address again to make sure I had seen right, and indeed it was correct. That's when I saw out of the corner of my eye a figure moving through the shadows inside the warehouse. Immediately my pulse quickened, and I felt a shiver start to run up my back. I immediately realized something was wrong, but I really wanted to trust Melissa. I looked back into the warehouse and strained to try to make out the figure in the shadows. At that moment, I couldn't help but think of the similarity of that scene with the recurring nightmare I had been having the last few nights. I called Melissa again. My voice was trembling now, but there was no answer. I hesitated between running back to my car and trying to find out what was going on, but I summoned all my courage to take a step into the darkness, and the figure remained still in the background. "Melissa, this isn't funny," I said, and then suddenly the figure melted into darkness and I listened in terror as the warehouse doors closed behind me, leaving me completely submerged in darkness. My heart was pounding as I stood there trying to figure out what was going on. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that it was Melissa trying to play a joke on me. I pulled out my cell phone to try to see in the dark. I dialed Melissa's number once more with no answer, so I decided to call her sister. She answered and I told her what was happening. I also gave her the address of where I was, and just at that moment, I could see the doors of the store open, and under the reflection of the streetlight, I saw Melissa's figure emerge. She was smiling, which made me think that she had really played a joke on me. Thank God. Hey, don't do this to me again. I swear I almost peed my pants. The words died in my mouth when I felt the blunt blow bang right on the left side of my head. And then everything went dark. Between the darkness of the warehouse and the minimal light of the street lamp, I couldn't realize that Melissa had a baseball bat in her hands and she hit me right in the face. I woke up on the dusty floor of the old warehouse with my hands and feet tied, while my eyes slowly reconstructed the scene. Melissa was next to me, hunched over with her back to me. "What's going on?" I asked her. I looked around and saw marks on the floor. They made no sense to me, but I was in the middle of them. Melissa turned her head to look at me, but said nothing, just sat there with a strange smile playing at the corner of her lips. It was a smile that sent shivers down my spine, a smile that contained no warmth, no sincerity. "Melissa, please," I said. Then she stood up and began to chant something in a strange language as she walked around lighting candles scattered around me, and in the candlelight I could see more her holding a knife and a composition notebook with inconsistent scribbles all over the pages. I could only make out a few words: Mom, sacrifice, blood moon. My stomach turned. Was she planning to sacrifice me? "Are you going to kill me?" I whispered to her, but she didn't answer. She was too fascinated with her singing. A moment later, she sat at my feet still singing, and at that moment I realized that I had lost forever the friend who was once my dearest person after my parents. Tears filled my eyes. "This won't bring her back, Melissa." She didn't listen, just continued to be immersed in her singing, until in a moment she opened her cold, empty eyes and turned her attention to the knife. She took it and lifted my shirt to expose my abdomen. I began to struggle to untie myself, but it was useless. I don't know where she learned to tie knots, but she learned it well. To my absolute horror, she began to carve a star into my stomach, while still singing that terrifying song that seemed straight out of the very underworld. I screamed as the knife cut me and my blood began to pour out of the wound, but when the knife was halfway through the star, the metal doors burst open. It was Melissa's father. At the sound of his voice, she burst out of her song, her eyes shifting between my stomach and her father's voice. He walked all the way into the warehouse, almost stumbling, and saw Melissa kneeling next to me, still holding the knife. She began to cry. "Melissa, my baby, what are you doing?" Her father was completely broken and very shocked. "Put the knife down, honey. Let's talk about this." "It's the only way," Melissa cried, bursting into tears, a desperate, almost neurotic cry. This was the first time I had seen Melissa cry since her mom's death. Once her father was close enough, he grabbed the hand where he had the knife and took it away. Then he sat down on the floor and hugged Melissa, or rather, he held her to his body like when you carry a baby, while they both cried painfully. While all this was happening, I was still on the floor, tied up and with my abdomen bleeding, but there was no way I was going to interrupt that moment because I felt it was absolutely necessary for both of us. Melissa's father carried her to the car, left her there, and then came back to untie me. After that, Melissa was taken to a specialized psychiatric center, where she received treatment for a little over a year, and fortunately managed to overcome her psychological crisis. However, And despite the deep affection I have for her, after that incident our friendship was deeply fractured, and although at one point she apologized for her actions, our relationship was never the same again. However, there are no hard feelings between us. We just went on with our lives, and we never saw each other again. Sometimes it is necessary to put distance even between those we love, to preserve our mental and emotional health. I spent the early stages of my life walking on the opposite side of the law. I never finished high school. I dropped out in high school, and this is a decision I will regret for the rest of my life. The first time I was under arrest, I was 20 years old, and it definitely wouldn't be the last, as I spent most of my 20s in and out of prison, nothing I'm proud of. When I turned 30, I decided to make a radical change in my life. I realized that I had no friends, no north. I tried attending different churches and charities in my city to see if I could find my calling in life, and during my search for meaning, I found Bill. He was exactly what I needed in life, especially at this complicated time. I had met Bill at some church event I was attending at the time. He said he identified himself as an agnostic, which I found rather odd since this was a Christian church event, as I said. He also said that he attended all the events because of the community aspect, as he claimed that all the people were too friendly and there was no other place in the world to have this good, loving camaraderie. He was very right about that, and that is that people are too friendly in the church. Personally, I'm not good at religion, so I'm not even sure what kind of church this was. What I do know is that the people were fantastic about Bill. Everyone loved Bill, even the church officials. No one cared about his faith stance, they just loved him anyway. And how could they not? He was a really great man with these people. He was constantly helping in any way he could, donating clothes, food, and most importantly, his time. I wasn't sure how Bill made money, but he had plenty and used it for good. He constantly gave to the poor and encouraged everyone to attend church events. He served food to the less fortunate in the front, as well as giving them clothes, blankets, and toiletries. Bill used to drive to very low-income areas of town and helped in any way he could. He was, by all reports, an amazing and caring human being. And I, in my search for meaning in life, would obviously end up gravitating directly to him without judging his character. Bill quickly took me under his wing, and I became his assistant. I helped with everything he did in the community. It seemed that being with him almost cleared my name. No one cared who I was in the past, thank God. They only cared about who I was in the present, something I was very grateful for. This life of cooperation and friendship continued for years, and along the way Bill became more than a boss to me, and in fact, became a true friend. When I had no place to live, Bill let me move into a small guest house he had adjacent to his house. We would get up early, start the day, and just make our rounds around town as much as we could, and Bill financed everything. This guy seemed to have an endless supply of money, but I never saw him work, and I never questioned it at all. One afternoon, when we were doing one of our usual charity events, I noticed for the first time that Bill was not himself. This man was always energetic and excited, happy with life and with a very high vibe, but this time he seemed too calm, distracted, almost like he was on another planet. And that caught my attention a little bit, but I didn't ask questions. That night, we were on our way back to his house, and I asked him if everything was okay, and all he did was take a deep breath and said yes, he was fine. Clearly, this was not it. Something was wrong. Later that evening, I looked out the windows of the guest house where I was staying, which was just behind Bill's house. His lights were on and the blinds were open, so I could clearly see inside this house. The guest house was probably 50 feet or so from the main house, that is, the house where he lived. So even though I could see clearly inside the house, I was still far enough away that I didn't know if he was okay, or maybe I just had a bad feeling. But I think my life of crime gave me an idea of when people are going to snap. I know because I hit my breaking point many times in life. That's what got me in trouble most of the time. And it seemed like Bill was at that point today. It was something I could just sense. I thought about it for a while, but finally decided to go see him, just to make sure he was okay. This man had given me so much, I thought I owed him at least this much. I walked across the yard that separated the guest house from his house, and when I got close enough I could hear someone yelling, and judging by his tone of voice, it was Bill. He was screaming. At that point I started to sneak back into the house, now to eavesdrop. I admit that I got close enough to hear him more clearly. He must have been talking on the phone because I could only hear him and no one else. He sounded very furious and angry, something that also struck me as odd, as I had never heard him raise his voice like that before. And now he was literally yelling at someone else and saying things that I still can't believe came out of his mouth. I slipped off to the side of the house so I could look out one of the windows. Then I saw Bill pacing frantically around the room, and he was indeed talking on the phone. At that moment, I heard him clearly say, "I don't care if you don't do this. I'll find someone else who can. I don't deal with this crap day in and day out for no reason. Do it immediately so I can finally get out of this hell." I could hardly believe it, but that was exactly what he said. I obviously had no idea what he meant by all that. But the moment he hung up the phone, he threw it against the wall with great force as he continued to scream. At that point, he suddenly turned around and then caught me looking out the window. I immediately darted out of the way, but I was sure he had seen me. I leaned against the side of his house, hoping I wouldn't hear the door open. But hope only lasts a moment, as they say, because the front door burst open and I immediately heard Bill yell my name. I stood up, feeling very embarrassed, because I was caught snooping. Part of me thought he would be fine because he was always so quiet and patient with me. But I couldn't be more wrong. Before I could articulate a word, this large, middle-aged man grabbed me by the collar of my flannel and pushed me against the wall of the house, and followed up by starting to yell so loudly in my face I could feel the saliva hitting my cheeks. "Everything I've done for you, and now I find you here, in my house, spying on me." I was silent. I didn't know what to say to him. I wanted to tell him that I was only there to make sure he was okay, but I was so in shock that I couldn't get the words out at the right time. After yelling in my face, Bill threw me to the ground with great force and yelled at me again, but this time telling me, "It's you, isn't it? It's you who wants to steal my money, isn't it?" I started to defend myself by claiming I had no idea what he was talking about, which was true. But when I started to stand up, he pushed me, and I fell back down. But in doing so, he kicked me in the face, at the same time barking, "Stay here." He slammed the door back in his way, and the kick shook me. I was so dazed I could see stars in front of my eyes. For a moment I regained my concentration and stood on my feet again. I looked out the window once more, and I could see him rummaging through a chest he had in the room. He seemed to be grabbing something, but I wasn't sure what it was, although it sounded heavy. At that point, I ran back to the guest house, but clearly not to spend the night. In any case, I grabbed a couple of personal items and ran back into the woods that bordered his property. As I did this, I could notice a head sticking out between the tree line. It was Bill wandering through the guest house and finally breaking down the door. Bill continued shouting my name and hurling insults and threats outside the guest house, while I could clearly see that he had a gun in his hand. That was what he was looking for in that chest in the room. I was walking through the woods as quietly as possible, avoiding being seen. Fortunately, I was shouting too loudly to be heard shuffling through the trees. I finally reached the road and ran as fast as I could, and as far as my legs would let me, looking back every few minutes to see if he was following me, but fortunately he wasn't. I was running as fast as I could, and as far as my legs would let me, looking back every few minutes to see if he was following me, but fortunately he was not. After running without stopping for several blocks, I finally arrived at a local convenience store, where I asked if the store could call the police for me, since I didn't have a cell phone. The moment the cops showed up, I told them everything. I really didn't know if there was anything they could do, but I thought that since Bill technically attacked me and then chased me, I felt I was in danger. After that, the police showed up at this house, and the next thing I knew, he was arrested. I don't know why he was arrested, as I was never informed for some reason, but when I Googled his name, nothing came up, which leads me to believe that Bill was actually a fake name. I spent years with this guy, and even lived just a few feet from his house, and he never led me to believe that he was hiding anything, or that he even had a violent bone in his body. Whatever secret he had, it eventually came crashing down on him. I have no idea if he intended to hurt me more that night, but the beating I received outside his house convinced me otherwise. This happened about 10 years ago when I was 12 years old. Before starting the story, I must clarify that all the names I will mention below are not the real ones. This for reasons of protecting the privacy of the protagonists. When I was in 6th grade, there was a girl in my class named Fanny. She was quite quiet and reserved, and didn't have many friends. In fact, I used to think she was a bit strange. However, one day I started talking to her during recess hours, and to my surprise, she turned out to be a very nice and funny girl, so much so that we became best friends pretty quickly. Fanny and I saw each other all the time, as we also lived relatively close. I even got to the point where I spent practically every weekend at her house, and then we would go to school together. I was at his house so often that I got to know everyone in his house: his mom, his dad, and his half-sister, daughter from his mom's previous marriage. However, even at my age, I was able to see that there was something strange about his dad, Roby. He always seemed very interested in me, and would often try to play fight with me, which I didn't think was a normal thing to do. I mean, why would a middle-aged man be so excited to play fight with an 11-year-old boy who wasn't his son? The thing is, when he was around, I felt really uncomfortable. Robbie, a short, fat man with gray to white hair, always had a strange smile on his face. The strange interactions with Roby started when he would steal bits of my food when I wasn't looking, and then laugh and make sure to put his arms around my shoulders to apologize. He was always wherever Fanny and I were, in the upstairs bedrooms, or downstairs in the garden. It didn't matter where, because he was always hanging around. There was one day when Fanny's grandmother on her mother's side was visiting at his house, and Roby kissed her on the mouth as a greeting. And as if that wasn't weird enough, it turned into the creepiest, most grotesque French kiss I've ever seen in my life. And he did it in front of Fanny and me. In some twisted way, this seemed kind of funny to the lady and him, as they both burst out laughing afterwards. I must say I was completely horrified, and that should have been reason enough to never go back to that house again. But I felt I had to do it for Fanny. After that incident, there was one day when we were playing in Fanny's room, and Roby came in without asking permission, and out of nowhere started arguing with her, and at one point took all of her dolls and put them in a garbage bag, threatening to throw them all in the dumpster. Obviously, an 11-year-old girl is going to be upset if she thinks her toys are going to be thrown in the trash can, so it's no wonder Fanny was hysterical. Suddenly, he came down the stairs with the bag full of toys, and we followed him. On the way, he was yelling at her, and so was she, demanding her dolls back. Then he threatened her, and told her that if she yelled at him like that again, he was going to make her regret it. That's when he started to take off his belt. Seeing this, Fanny started pushing me towards the front door, the one right in front of the stairs, to get me to come out. At that point, she was half laughing, as if she was trying to convince me that she didn't mean it. But even at that age, I was able to tell that she was actually terrified and embarrassed, and that she really didn't want me to be there to witness what was to come. As soon as I was outside the house, Rob slammed the door shut, and after a few moments, all I heard was Fanny screaming at the top of her lungs. I was so scared and didn't want to leave her, but all I could do was stand there until I found the courage to go back inside. Within a few minutes after the incident, I went upstairs ready to help Fanny defend herself from Roby's abuse, even if it meant getting a couple of belts myself. However, upon reaching her room, I got Fanny sitting on the floor, brushing the hair of one of her dolls. She was smiling at me, but obviously her face was freshly stained with her tears. There were no visible bruises or marks on her face or arms, but he could have hit her anywhere on her body that wasn't visible to the naked eye. At that moment, I didn't know what to feel. I wanted to protect her, and I felt the best way to do that was to keep going to her house. That's why I didn't say anything to my mom, because I thought that knowing this, she would surely forbid me to go to that place again. Obviously, this was a very foolish thing for me to do, because my mother probably could have called the authorities or done something to really help her, but instead I put myself at risk too. And just a few days later, an incident occurred that I will forever remember as one of the most disgusting and frightening experiences of my entire life. That night I had slept over at Fanny's house, as was my habit, so I woke up in the middle of the night feeling thirsty. Fanny's room was the first one down the hall, so it was very close to the stairs, so I decided to go down to the kitchen to get some water. But when I got to the top of the stairs, I took a look into the living room, and it was there that I came across a scene so shocking and disgusting that I will never in my life forget. Lying on the couch was Robbie, with nothing but his socks on, holding the cell phone in front of him with one hand, and with his other hand on his crotch. He was doing what you guys are thinking. This was something so horrible and shocking to me that I was completely paralyzed at the foot of the stairs, and I wasn't even able to move a muscle. But the creepiest and most disgusting thing of all is that when he realized that I was looking at him, and even seeing my state of panic, which was surely evident, he didn't stop. On the contrary, he just stared at me with the most creepy, disgusting, and revolting look that anyone has ever given me, and continued doing what he was doing. This traumatic encounter lasted only a few moments, and as soon as I could recover from the shock, I ran upstairs completely terrified, entered Fanny's room, and locked the door. She was still asleep, and I didn't want to wake her up, but since then I couldn't sleep a wink. And while I was waiting for the first rays of the sun to appear so I could go home, that disgusting image kept repeating itself in my mind over and over again, causing me disgust and panic at the same time. That was the last time I stayed overnight in that house. If my parents had ever found out about this, they would probably go and kill him. But I never dared to tell my parents, or anyone, about this. But it was extremely traumatic for me, and it became a recurring nightmare that even to this day still haunts me. I know it may seem a little silly, being that I'm a grown man now, but it's really amazing the after effects that traumatic experiences you go through in your childhood can leave on your psyche. This was something I had to take therapy for some years ago, when I realized that this terrifying experience was having serious consequences in my personal life. I won't describe how, but I will summarize that it affected me in a much deeper way than I would have liked to admit. But I was not the only one to whom this man left major traumas in his life. A few years ago, I talked to Fanny about it. She now lives in another city and is in college. We met by chance at an academic event, and then met at a cafe where we talked for several hours. That day, she finally opened up to me and told me that, like me, she also had to get psychological help. She told me that a couple of years later, Robbie sexually abused her older half-sister, which caused her mother to finally decide to report him. She also mentioned that he beat her regularly, and a few weeks before he was arrested for what he did to her sister, he brutally beat her in front of a friend of hers, who also called the police, although for some reason, he was released shortly thereafter on bail. That afternoon, my friend and I talked at length for hours. I also told her about the incident that night and how it affected me, as well as all the things I could notice when I stayed at her house. And finally, I let her know how happy I was that they had finally managed to get rid of that obnoxious man. This happened when I was 5 years old and my best friend was 6. I'll give you a quick description of my school. The building was L-shaped, the short end was not in use at the time, and cars stopped to the right of the L, or behind the short end. The road was practically all around the school, but only in the places mentioned above, cars could stop. Now, we were at school one day, and my friend did something that really pissed me off. He grabbed my colored pens without asking, so I wanted to take revenge, so shortly after recess started, about halfway through, I saw my best friend walking towards the back of the building. So I followed him, thinking he was going to do something funny. But as he turned the corner, I saw a man in a car offering him candy through the open passenger door. In my childish brain, I wondered, why doesn't that guy just get out and give him candy? I thought this because the man was asking her to get in the car to give him the candy, and it seemed to me that he could just get out and give it to her. My friend left the perimeter of the school and approached the parking lot where the car with the guy with the candy was, while I had stayed a few meters away. After all, it was not me who was being offered the candy, and when my friend was about to reach the door where the guy was, I realized that this was the perfect time for my revenge. I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop him from receiving the candy from this gentleman. And so I was about 2 meters away from the door of the car. I shouted from the corner that the teacher was calling him, and that if he didn't come right now, I was going to tell him that he was out of the allowed area of the school. He turned around a bit angrily, but I gave him a smug look and started yelling, "Teacher, teacher," in a somewhat joking tone. At that moment, for some reason, I noticed that the man in the car closed the passenger door, while the other one started the engine quickly and began to reverse. My friend looked at me very annoyed, thinking that it was my fault the candy man had left, and I, in my 5-year-old innocence, started laughing and sticking my tongue out at him, thinking that I had trolled him. At that moment, my friend looked at me very annoyed and started running after me, threatening to hit me for chasing away the candy lord, while telling me that he was just envious because the Lord had thought he was so cool that he wanted to give him cookies and candy. My friend started running me all over the playground, and that's when the teacher intervened. She scolded us for fighting, and then my friend started telling her, very upset, what I had done to him and how I had chased away the Lord of the candy. At that instant, my teacher's eyes widened like saucers, and she began to look very alarmed as she pulled all the children into the classroom and called the other teachers. I remember thinking that her reaction was due to the prank I had played on my friend. I thought maybe I had crossed the line. But then, when we entered the classroom, the teacher gave us a little lecture about why we shouldn't accept anything from a stranger. The next day, a parents' meeting was called, and since then the school hired a security guard to stay in the parking area to make sure that the children did not go near it, and that no strangers parked there. As I look back, now as an adult and father of 2 children, I shudder to think how close my friend came to being kidnapped, and who knows what things would have happened to him. I shudder to know that, had it not been for my little quip to get back at him, maybe the story would have been very different.